Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime History Stories. Tonight, I want to tell you about a world that existed behind palace walls for nearly 1,000 years. A world that most of us have only seen in paintings, usually the wrong paintings, showing us the wrong things. A world where women who had nothing, who came as captives to golden cages, sometimes ended up controlling entire empires. Picture this moment for a second. It's the late 1800s. A European aristocrat walks through the Grand Bazaar of Istanbul, the great market, the heart of commerce in the Ottoman Empire. He sees women, or rather he doesn't. He sees covered figures moving through the streets like ghosts, their faces hidden, their bodies concealed in layers of silk and linen. To him, they are mysteries, invisible, powerless. But if he were to follow those women home, to the palaces where they actually lived, he would discover something entirely different. He would find administrative offices. He would find budgets larger than some kingdoms. He would find women making decisions about war and peace. He would find women whose words could topple generals and remake political alliances. He would find the harem. And it was nothing like the paintings. For centuries, Western artists painted the harem as a bedroom, a place of endless pleasure. Reclining women with dark eyes, draped in silks that barely covered their skin, surrounded by cushions and perfume and idle luxury. These paintings hang in museums today, museums in Paris and London and New York. They have titles like The Harem or A Concubine's Chamber. Europeans could barely contain their fantasies when they looked at these images. But here is the strange truth. These paintings were almost entirely imaginary. They were painted by men who had never set foot in a harem. They were painted based on rumors and rumors of rumors and the fever dreams of European aristocrats. They reflected not what the harem actually was, but what Europe wanted it to be. Something exotic, something sensual, something that confirmed European ideas of both Eastern decadence and Eastern otherness. The reality of the harem was radically different. The harem, the word itself comes from the Arabic haram, meaning forbidden or sacred, was not primarily a place of pleasure. It was an institution, a fully formed mini-state within the state. It had its own government, its own hierarchy, its own treasury. It had managers and secretaries and record keepers. It had spies. It had a postal system. It had schools. It had hospitals. Some harems contained over 1,000 people. The harem of the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, what we call Istanbul today, occupied over 300 rooms carved into the palace complex called Topkapi. It was built over centuries. Architects designed it. Thousands of workers constructed it. It was a city unto itself, a female city within a male city, within the greater empire. The women inside that city were not simply concubines. They were administrators, teachers, musicians, artists, healers, spies, politicians, and sometimes rulers. Some were born into it. Some were enslaved into it. Some were strategic marriages. Some were gifts. Some bought themselves in through wit and talent and ambition. What none of them were, and this is crucial, was powerless. Tonight, we're going to step past the guards at the harem entrance. We're going to walk past the eunuchs who controlled access. We're going to move through those 300 rooms and see what actually happened there. We'll see how women who arrived as nothing became something. How they navigated the strange politics of isolation. How they turned the very constraints placed upon them into instruments of power. How the women behind the walls sometimes wielded more influence than the men on the thrones. We'll discover that history's greatest empires were often shaped not by the men we read about in textbooks, but by women whose names have been almost completely erased. And we'll learn why the mythology of the harem, the European fantasy, tells us almost nothing about the reality. So close your eyes, get comfortable. There's no rush. We have all night. Let me tell you what actually happened in those forbidden chambers. Let me tell you about ambition and politics and the strange mathematics of power. Let me tell you about women who changed the world from inside locked rooms. This is the true story of the harem. When we think of the harem today, our minds go to fantasy. We see what European painters showed us. We see lounging women in impossible poses. We see the eunuch at the door. We see a space defined by pleasure rather than purpose. But I want you to consider something else entirely. Imagine for a moment that you are a young woman living in 1450. You live in a small village. Your life is defined by labor. You wake before dawn. You tend goats. You work in fields. Your hands are rough from work. Your back aches. You will probably never leave your village. You will probably never learn to read. You will probably have children and watch some of them die. And then one day, soldiers come. They raid your village. They take you. They put you on a boat. And after months at sea and markets and exchanges, you end up in a palace. A massive palace, larger than anything you ever imagined could exist. For the first time in your life, you sleep on soft beds. For the first time, you eat food that isn't porridge and bread. For the first time, people teach you things. Music, language, how to move, how to dress, how to think. This is not an easy transition. You are traumatized. You have been ripped from everything you know. You may never see your family again. But, and this is important, your life has materially improved. You have moved from subsistence to security, from invisibility to noticed, from powerless to potentially powerful. This is the contradiction at the heart of the harem. It was a system of oppression. It involved slavery and captivity and loss of freedom. And yet, for many women, it represented unprecedented opportunity. In the Ottoman Empire, which we'll talk about at length tonight, women literally could not inherit property. They had no legal rights to own land. They could not initiate divorce. They were under the guardianship of men, fathers, then husbands, then sons. Their entire existence was legally circumscribed. But women in the harem, especially if they bore sons, could become so wealthy they rivaled sultans. They could make political decisions. They could move armies. They could determine who lived and who died. So when we ask, what was the harem? We have to hold two truths at once. It was a cage. It was also, paradoxically, a ladder. The paintings got this completely wrong. They showed pleasure. They showed sensuality. They showed luxury divorced from any purpose. But the real harem was about something far more interesting. It was about how power moves when official channels are closed. Consider the mathematics. In an Islamic system, a man could legally have up to 4 wives, but a sultan might have dozens of concubines, hundreds even. These women had no legal status. They were not wives. They could be sent away at any moment. Their children might or might not be recognized. They had no guaranteed inheritance. They had no security. And yet, if one of those women bore the sultan a son, everything changed. She became the mother of the heir. She became the most important woman in the empire. She became unkillable. She became powerful. This created a system where women competed fiercely for something that could not be earned through any conventional means. Not through birth, because they were often slaves. Not through intelligence, because the system didn't officially recognize female intelligence. Not through education, because many never received formal education. They competed for the attention of a single man, and paradoxically, this competition created a space where women could accumulate power by understanding the politics better than anyone else. They became experts in influence. They became strategists. They became diplomats, operating in a space with no official diplomatic protocol. The harem was not the bedroom Europe imagined. It was a pressure cooker of ambition, and when the pressure built high enough, the women inside it could reshape empires. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's step back. Let's understand how the harem actually came to exist, because the story of its origins is not what you'd expect. To understand the harem, we need to travel to Southeast Asia, specifically to Brunei. Brunei is a tiny sultanate on the island of Borneo. Tiny, a place most people have never heard of, a place most people couldn't find on a map. In the mid-1800s, a British traveler visited Brunei. He documented what he saw in meticulous detail, and what he saw was a sultan, an aging, isolated man who was obsessed with one thing: keeping his women completely separated from the outside world. The sultan had built a harem that looked, according to the traveler's description, like a ramshackle compound. It was not grand, it was not luxurious, it was functional, bare, austere even. Inside, over 80 women lived with minimal clothing and minimal possessions. Most of them would never leave that compound. But here's what fascinated the traveler. The sultan himself sometimes worked on maintaining the buildings. He was so paranoid about male workers having access to the women that he personally helped repair the structures. The sultan was so committed to isolation that he was willing to do manual labor. This tells us something important about the philosophy behind the harem. It was not, at its heart, about romance or pleasure or seduction. It was about control. It was about ensuring something very specific, that no woman could develop any relationship or loyalty outside the walls, that no woman could be influenced by any man except the one who owned her. This makes sense if you think about it from a royal perspective. A sultan is surrounded by threats. His generals might betray him, his advisors might plot against him, his brothers might assassinate him. The only people in his life who have no political ambitions of their own are his women, or so the theory goes. The only people who cannot inherit the throne or gather armies or make alliances against him are the people locked in the harem, except, and this is crucial, they can influence the people who can do those things. The women in the harem gave birth to heirs. The heirs learned from their mothers. The mothers whispered advice in the night. The mothers shaped the future ruler's character, his priorities, his alliances. The women in the harem were therefore not powerless at all. They were simply operating through channels that the official system of power didn't recognize. Now, was the harem originally Islamic? This is a question historians have debated extensively, and the answer is no. The practice of female seclusion predates Islam by centuries. We have evidence of it in ancient Assyria, in ancient Persia, in ancient India, in ancient China, and later in ancient Greece. Female seclusion was an ancient strategy for controlling women's sexuality and ensuring that children were unquestionably the property of their legal father. Islam, when it emerged in the 600s, institutionalized some of these practices, but it did not invent them. It adapted them. The Quran does mention the hijab and the separation of genders, but the Quran also says that women should be allowed to go to the mosque, should be allowed to work, should have rights to divorce and property. The text is actually more complicated than many people realize. But in practice, many Islamic societies took these references to modesty and separation and expanded them into complete systems of female seclusion. They built the harem, and it spread from the Islamic world to Hindu India to Buddhist Southeast Asia. The harem became a status symbol. The bigger your harem, the more powerful you appeared to be. It became a sign of wealth and control. In the Ottoman Empire, which we'll focus on extensively, the harem grew into something that started in the 1400s and became increasingly elaborate through the 1600s and 1700s. It became the most organized harem in history, the most documented, the most studied. The Ottoman Topkapi Palace, where I mentioned earlier that there were over 300 rooms dedicated to the harem, was designed by architects who understood one crucial thing. Isolation requires infrastructure. You cannot simply lock women away. You need systems to feed them, to educate them, to manage their health, to track their activities, to mediate between them, to maintain allegiances and manage resentments, to handle the politics of the space. And this infrastructure, this apparatus, this system, it required administrators. And many of those administrators, it turned out, had to be women. This was the beginning of female power in the harem, not through seduction or romance or the fantasy the painting suggested, but through administration, through understanding how systems work, through being willing to do the unglamorous work of actually managing a large population of people. Some of the most powerful women in Ottoman history were not beautiful concubines. They were managers. They were organizers. They were women who understood power as process rather than passion. Let me tell you about one of them. In the 1600s, there was a woman named Roxelana. You may know her from the Turkish television series called The Magnificent Century. In the show, she's portrayed as a great beauty who seduces the Sultan and becomes his favorite. The reality was more complicated and far more interesting. Roxelana was actually born Anastasia Lisowski. She came from what is now Poland or Ukraine. The sources disagree. At some point she was captured, likely by Crimean Tatars who regularly conducted slave raids in Eastern Europe. She was brought to a market in Constantinople and sold. The Sultan who purchased her was named Suleiman. He was called the Magnificent by the Europeans, though the Ottomans called him the Lawgiver. He had been ruling for years already. He had dozens of concubines. The system was that he might spend a night with any of them. They competed for his attention and favor. Roxelana, according to historical accounts, was not necessarily the most beautiful, but she was clever. She was educated. She understood how the political system worked. And over time, she accumulated more and more influence. Here's where it gets interesting. She eventually convinced Suleiman to marry her legally. Before her, sultans didn't marry their concubines. They simply had children with them. But Roxelana became an official wife. This gave her official status. It gave her security. And then, and this is critical, she bore a son who survived to adulthood and became the heir. Her status transformed overnight. She was no longer just a concubine competing for attention. She was the mother of the future sultan. She became untouchable. She became powerful. Historical accounts suggest she actively managed Ottoman foreign policy. She advocated for certain alliances and against others. She attempted to influence which of her sons would ultimately inherit. She wielded power that was officially not supposed to belong to her. But we're getting ahead of the story. We need to ask a more fundamental question. How did women like Roxelana end up in the harem in the first place? This is where the history gets dark, because it's the history of slavery, and slavery on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. Let me paint you a picture. It's 1600. It's the Crimean Khanate, which sat on the northern shore of the Black Sea. The Crimean Khans made much of their income through slave trading. They conducted regular raids into Eastern Europe, into what is now Ukraine, Poland, Russia, and Romania. These raids were brutal. Warriors would sweep into villages at night. They would burn buildings. They would kill men who resisted. And they would capture women and children. A single raid might capture hundreds of people. The largest single raid we have records for captured around 100,000 people in 1 year. 1 year. 100,000 people. These captives were then transported to markets. The most famous markets were in Constantinople, but they existed throughout the Islamic world, in Alexandria, in Baghdad, in Tunis, in Marrakesh. Young women, girls really, often would be displayed. Buyers would examine them. They would check their teeth. They would check if they were virgins. They would assess their potential value. The pricing was brutal and explicit. A white European woman was worth more than a woman of African descent. A virgin was worth more than a non-virgin. A young woman was worth more than an older woman. A woman with specific skills, music, languages, beauty, commanded higher prices. The most expensive women, the ones who might bring thousands of gold coins, were often sold to sultans' palaces or wealthy aristocrats' harems. This was not romance. This was not seduction. This was a transaction. A woman who might fetch a high price at market could end up in a palace. And that was actually, in material terms, often better than the alternative. Because the alternative was often to be sold into a brothel or to a wealthy merchant as a household slave. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because numbers convey the scale better than narrative. In the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, somewhere between 3 and 5 million people were enslaved in the Islamic slave trade. Some historians argue the number was higher, some argue lower, but the consensus is in the millions. This was a slave trade that rivaled, in sheer volume, the transatlantic slave trade. Upwards of 80% of the enslaved were women. These women came from Eastern Europe, from Sub-Saharan Africa, from the Caucasus, from everywhere around the Muslim world, and they ended up in harems and households and brothels throughout the Ottoman Empire and its neighboring Islamic states. Now, I want to be very careful here about how we talk about this, because it's easy to look at this history and see only victimhood. And victimhood was certainly part of the reality. Many of these women lived terrible lives. Many were abused. Many died far from home, never to see their families again. But the historical reality is also more complicated than victimhood alone. Some of the enslaved women who entered harems managed to build genuinely powerful lives. They learned to read and write in languages they didn't know before. They learned to navigate complex social hierarchies. They accumulated wealth. They influenced empires. It was still wrong. Slavery is always wrong. But within that wrong system, some women found ways to survive, to thrive, to build power. And this brings us to the question that gets at the heart of the harem. How exactly did women with no official status, no legal rights, no political power, manage to become, sometimes, kingmakers? The answer involves understanding the infrastructure I mentioned earlier. It involves understanding who actually ran the harem on a day-to-day basis. Because here's the thing. The Sultan had other things to do. He had armies to command. He had taxes to collect. He had neighboring empires to watch and worry about. Someone else had to actually manage the harem, and that someone else was often a woman. Let me introduce you to a term you've probably never heard. The Kizlaraga. It's Turkish. It translates roughly to chief of the girls, or perhaps keeper of the girls. It was the title given to the eunuch who served as manager of the imperial harem in the Ottoman Empire. For much of Ottoman history, the Kizlaraga was the second or third most powerful person in the entire empire, more powerful than most military generals, more powerful than most bureaucrats, because he controlled access to the Sultan. And the Sultan, in an absolute monarchy, was everything. Access to him was the most valuable currency in the empire. The Kizlaraga controlled who the Sultan saw, which concubines were available on any given night, what information reached his ear, what information was filtered out. Over time, particularly in the 1600s and 1700s, the power of the Kizlaraga grew so great that the Sultan sometimes became almost a figurehead. This was called the Sultanate of Women in Ottoman history. It was a period when the harem wielded more real power than the Sultan himself. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Let's focus on the daily architecture of the harem, because understanding the system is essential to understanding how power flowed within it. Picture the Topkapi Palace. It's an enormous complex. The Sultan's private quarters are in one section, the government buildings are in another, and the harem occupies an entire section unto itself. It has its own gates, it has its own guards, it has walls separating it from the rest of the palace. Inside, there's a hierarchy. At the top is the Valide Sultan, the mother of the current Sultan, if she's still alive. She has the most luxurious apartments. She has the largest staff. She wields the most authority within the harem. Below her are the official wives, if there are any. Usually there's only one or two, and they're there for dynastic reasons, to create alliances through marriage. Below them are the concubines of varying ranks. The Sultan might have favorites. Those favorites get better rooms, better clothing, more access to money, but status could change at any moment. A new woman might catch the Sultan's eye. A favorite might fall out of favor. Then there are the children, the young princes and princesses. They live in the harem until a certain age. The princes are educated there. They learn Ottoman traditions, Islamic doctrine, languages, some military training. The princesses are educated in how to be wives and mothers. Then there are the servants, hundreds of them. Some are enslaved. Some are free women hired for specific purposes: cooks, seamstresses, musicians, teachers. And managing all of this complex city-state within the palace, were administrators. Many of them women. The head administrator was often a woman called the harem kahya. She managed the day-to-day operations. She managed conflicts between the concubines. She mediated disputes. She reported to the Valide Sultan and the Kizlaraga. She also, in many cases, wielded incredible power. Let me give you a concrete example of how this power manifested. In the 1650s, there was a woman named Kösem Sultan. Her name means Kösem the lady. She had been a concubine, had borne a son who became Sultan, had become Valide Sultan, the mother of the ruling Sultan. And she had accumulated such power that she essentially ran the Ottoman Empire for decades. Kösem Sultan kept detailed records. She knew the budget of every department of government. She knew which officials were loyal and which might betray. She had spies reporting to her. She was, in essence, running a secret police operation from inside the harem. When she decided that a certain general was a threat, He could be recalled from the military. When she wanted someone elevated, that happened. She could make or break careers without ever appearing in public. And she did this all while officially having no political role whatsoever. This is the key to understanding how the harem actually functioned. The power was there. It was real. It shaped empires. But it operated through unofficial channels. It was hidden. It was not supposed to exist. The official narrative was that women in the harem had no power. They existed for pleasure, for bearing heirs, for adorning the Sultan's life. That was the story the Ottoman government told. The reality was that some of the most important decisions in the empire were made in the harem by women who officially had no authority. This created a system where intelligence and manipulation were more valuable than beauty, where understanding people was more valuable than charm, where patience and long-term thinking could overcome any momentary setback. In a system where women had no legal power, this made them extraordinarily dangerous. It made them threats to the official hierarchy of men. And sometimes, when that threat became too obvious, the men in power moved to reduce it. But here's the thing about a system of hidden power. It's very hard to stop without destroying the system itself. Because if the harem truly operated as the official narrative suggested, as purely ornamental, purely for pleasure, then its power couldn't exist. But if the power had to be acknowledged and dismantled, then the entire fiction would collapse. The entire careful system of denial would come undone. So instead, the power persisted. It evolved. It adapted. It continued throughout Ottoman history, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, but always present. Now let's turn to a different question. How did a woman actually climb this ladder? What were the mechanisms of advancement? Let's imagine you're a young woman who's entered the harem. Let's say you were captured or sold. You arrived frightened and disoriented. You don't speak the language well. You don't understand the customs. You're in a place where literally everything is unfamiliar. What happens to you next depends entirely on what happens next. Whether the Sultan notices you. This is the first rung of the ladder, and it's entirely outside your control. It depends on chance, on whether you happen to be in the right place at the right time, on whether the Sultan finds you attractive, on whether his eye happens to land on you one evening. If he doesn't notice you, you might spend years in the harem without ever entering his quarters. You would work. You would cook or clean or make music or whatever your role was. You would live a life of relative comfort compared to slavery outside the palace, but of absolute powerlessness compared to the women he did notice. If he does notice you, if he calls you to his rooms, then something changes. You're now a potential mother of the heir. You're suddenly valuable in a new way. Even if nothing happens that first night, even if you're called and then never called again, you've now been marked. Other women know. Other women might treat you differently, either with more respect or with more resentment, depending on where they stand in the hierarchy. But let's say you catch his eye more than once. Let's say he likes you. Let's say you become one of his regular companions. Now you have access. You can request things. You can have private conversations with the Sultan. You can mention ideas or concerns. You can influence him in small ways. This is the second rung, and it's still largely about chance, about luck, about whether the Sultan continues to be interested in you. The third rung, real power, comes if you become pregnant. If you bear him a son, your entire status transforms. You're no longer a temporary favorite. You're the mother of a potential heir. You're essential. You're protected. Your son will be educated in the palace. If your son lives to adulthood and becomes Sultan, you might become Valida Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. But here's the thing. Bearing a son requires you to maintain access to the Sultan over multiple years. It requires you to avoid being dismissed. It requires luck, the luck of conceiving, the luck of carrying a child to term, the luck of the child surviving infancy. And bearing a son is just the beginning, because now you're in competition with other mothers of princes, because the Sultan might have multiple sons with different women. And when the Sultan dies, there will be a succession. Usually, the most senior adult son inherits. But sometimes, the empire is so destabilized by competing claims that it descends into civil war. Some sultans had dozens of sons. Most of them died. A few survived, and the mothers of the survivors were the ones positioned for power. This is where patience becomes a virtue. Women in the harem who understood that they couldn't compete directly, that they didn't have beauty or charm or sexual attractiveness, often played a longer game. They invested in relationships with other women. They built networks. They became indispensable. A woman might become known as an excellent teacher. She would teach young princes. The princes would come to love and respect her. Years later, when one of those princes became sultan, she would have his ear. Or a woman might become known as a mediator. When women in the harem fought, and they did fight viciously, she would be called in to resolve disputes. She would accumulate grateful allies. Or a woman might become known as someone who could be trusted with secrets. She would be the confidant of the Valide Sultan. She would know things. She would carry information. She would build power through information. These were the women who sometimes ended up as the most powerful people in the harem. Not the most beautiful, not the Sultan's personal favorites, but the ones who understood that power comes from relationships and from making yourself indispensable. Let me tell you about one specific woman who did this. Her name was Nur Banu. She was born Greek, or possibly Albanian. The sources are unclear. She was sold into slavery and ended up in the harem of an Ottoman prince named Selim. She bore Selim a son. When Selim became sultan, she became his concubine of elevated status. But here's what matters. Nur Banu was extraordinarily smart. She learned to read and write in Ottoman Turkish. She learned the political system. She memorized the names and positions of important officials. She understood the empire's finances better than many government bureaucrats. When her son became old enough to rule independently, Nur Banu didn't fade into the background like many mothers did. Instead, she maintained power. she continued to involve herself in state affairs. She accumulated wealth. She made strategic alliances. She lived to be very old for the time, probably into her 70s, and she wielded power for decades. But notice, her power came not from beauty or from the Sultan's preference, but from intellect, from patience, and from making herself irreplaceable. This pattern repeated throughout Ottoman history. The most powerful women in harems were often not the most beautiful, but the most calculating, the most patient, the ones who understood that power is built over time, not given in moments of passion. Now we should ask, what about the women who didn't have sons? What about the women who weren't favorites? What happened to them? Let's talk about the women who didn't become mothers of heirs. The vast majority of women in the harem never did. They lived their entire lives in the palace without ever bearing a son. Some never even entered the Sultan's quarters. But they didn't disappear. They didn't become invisible. Some of them became extraordinarily powerful. Let me introduce you to a category of woman that barely appears in the European paintings of harems. A category that had no official title or recognized status. Women we might call the administrators of the hidden. In the Ottoman harem, there were women whose job was to gather intelligence, to know what every other woman was doing, to report infractions, to keep the Valide Sultan and the Kisla Raga informed about tensions and resentments and alliances. They were not officially spies. They held no recognized position, but they were everywhere. They had access. They could observe. They could listen. They could report. And in a system where knowledge is power, they wielded an enormous amount of power. These women could make or break other women. They could report that a woman was misbehaving, was speaking ill of the Sultan, was in a secret relationship, was plotting. Whether any of this was true or false almost didn't matter. An accusation, once made to the right people, could result in exile or execution. So these women, these keepers of secrets, were feared. They were protected. They were given small luxuries and concessions. They were allowed privileges. Then there were the women who worked as matchmakers and facilitators between the harem and the outside world. This is actually one of the most interesting roles, and it gets at something crucial about harems that the European paintings completely missed. Harems were not hermetically sealed. They were not cut off from the world. They had connections to the world, and those connections had to be managed. In the Ottoman harem, and in other harems throughout the Islamic world, there were women whose job was to maintain communications with the outside. Jewish women, often. Christian women sometimes. Women whose ethnic or religious identity allowed them to move between the harem and the world outside. These women, sometimes called kiras or intermediaries, would bring news. They would facilitate trade. A woman in the harem might want particular fabrics. The kira would smuggle them in. A woman might want to know what was happening in the city. The kira would bring information. In return, the kira would be paid. These were business transactions. The women in the harem had money. They received allowances from the Sultan. They received gifts from officials seeking their favor. They inherited from their children if they had any. They spent this money on goods and services. They bought luxury items. They invested in people. The kiras who served harems became extraordinarily wealthy. Some of them became influential in their own right. They could move between worlds. They could carry messages. They could broker deals. And their power came from understanding that a sealed system, truly sealed, cannot function. That even in the most carefully guarded harem, there had to be points of connection to the outside world. And whoever controlled those points controlled an important piece of power. Then there were the women whose power came from art and education. In many harems, particularly in Ottoman and Persian harems, there were women who were trained in music, poetry, calligraphy, painting. These were not trivial accomplishments. To be an accomplished musician or poet in the Islamic world was to have significant status, and in the harem, these accomplished women became teachers. Princes were taught by them. Young concubines were taught by them. They shaped the minds of the empire's future leaders. A woman who taught a prince who later became sultan had extraordinary influence. That prince remembered her. That prince revered her. When he came to power, she could request things. She could suggest ideas. She could advocate for causes. She had the ear of the most powerful person in the empire. Some of the most famous women in Ottoman history were poets and musicians. Mihrimah Sultan was known for her intellectual pursuits. Hurrem Sultan, Roxelana, was known for her literacy and her correspondence with foreign powers. These women used their education as a path to power. Not through seduction, the paintings again got this wrong, but through intellect, through being worth talking to. And finally, let's talk about the women who wielded power through financial savvy. In the Ottoman and Persian harems, women could accumulate wealth. They received money from the sultan. They received gifts. They sometimes received income from properties they owned or controlled, and some of these women became incredibly rich. With wealth came options. A rich woman in the harem could buy influence. She could gift money to officials seeking her favor. She could commission art or patronage that elevated her status. She could fund schools or charitable works that bore her name. The wealthiest women in harems sometimes became patrons of the arts. They funded buildings. They funded hospitals. They became philanthropists. And philanthropy in the Islamic world conferred respect and status. So you had a strange situation where some women in harems, women with no official political role, wielded more financial and cultural power than many government officials. All of this brings us to the question, what happened to these women when the Sultan died? What happened to the harem when power transferred to a new leader? There's a story I need to tell you. It requires us to talk about something difficult. It requires us to confront a practice that happened, that was real, that shaped history. Let me take you to a moment in time. It's approximately 1900. It's somewhere in the Ottoman Empire or in the Middle East. A boy is about 8 years old. His father has decided that his son will have a better life if he becomes a eunuch, castrated so that he cannot have children, cannot threaten anyone's position, and can therefore be trusted in positions of authority. The father brings the boy to a man who performs this operation. The operation is not surgical by modern standards. It's done with a sharp blade. There's no anesthesia. There's no antibiotics afterward. The boy experiences excruciating pain. He bleeds. Many boys died from infection. This was not rare. This was a common practice. Estimates suggest that thousands of boys every year were castrated to become eunuchs. This is difficult to talk about because it involves harm to children, but it's necessary to understand because it's part of the history of harems. Eunuchs served as guards in harems because the logic was simple. A man who cannot produce children is a safe man. He cannot threaten the Sultan's bloodline. He cannot secretly father children and create competing claims to the throne. He is, in theory, completely loyal to the Sultan because he has nothing to gain through rebellion. He cannot inherit. He cannot start a dynasty. The most important eunuch in Ottoman harems was, as I mentioned earlier, the Kislaraga, the chief eunuch. He controlled access to the Sultan. He managed the harem. He wielded extraordinary power. There's a dark irony here. The men who were castrated, who were literally incapable of having their own bloodline, often wielded more real political power than the Sultan himself. They accumulated wealth. They built influence. They made decisions that shaped empires. Some of the most famous political figures in Ottoman history were eunuchs. Ibrahim Pasha, for instance, was the Grand Vizier, essentially the Prime Minister, of Suleiman the Magnificent. He was a eunuch. He wielded more political power than almost anyone in the empire. He was wealthy, influential, and feared. And then one day, he fell out of favor, and he was executed. This is the constant background threat in any system where the person in power is surrounded by people who have no official right to power. At any moment, the person at the top can decide to remove you. You serve at pleasure. Your wealth and status can evaporate overnight. But within that precarious system, eunuchs sometimes found their footing. Some eunuchs genuinely loved the Sultan they served. They formed intense emotional bonds. They became trusted advisors. They wielded power, not through formal position, but through relationship and trust. Now, I want to tell you something interesting about the relationship between eunuchs and the women in harems. Because it's a strange thing, the people who guarded the women were the castrated men, the men who could be around the women without the threat of sexuality. And over time, some of these eunuchs became the closest confidants of the women they guarded. A eunuch might spend decades serving in a harem. He would watch the women age and die. He would see young women arrive and mature. He would develop real relationships with them. They were almost like family to him, except for the power dynamics. Because he was also their jailer. He was also the one who carried out punishments if women violated rules. Some eunuchs and women in harems developed relationships that were almost familial. There are historical accounts of eunuchs and concubines who were extremely close. They wrote letters to each other when separated. They requested that they be allowed to remain together. It's a strange dynamic. Both were trapped in the system. Both were property, in a sense. Both were dependent on the Sultan's whims, and sometimes they formed genuine bonds. But it's important not to romanticize this. The relationship was always marked by power differential. The eunuch could always betray the woman. The woman could always accuse the eunuch of improper behavior, which would result in his execution. So let me ask you, what was it like for a man to be castrated, to have your sexuality removed, to be placed in a position where you were surrounded by women you could never touch, to be dependent on another man's whim for your entire life? Psychologically, this had to be devastating. Some eunuchs, according to historical accounts, became deeply depressed. Some became bitter. Some become extremely powerful, out of a need to control something, anything, in a life where they controlled almost nothing. And some formed genuine attachments to the women around them. Not sexual attachments, but emotional ones. Loyalty, duty, sometimes even love, though not the romantic kind. The history of eunuchs in harems is tragic and complex. They were victims of a system that removed their physical capacity for sexuality. They were exploited for that removed sexuality. And yet, some of them wielded extraordinary power. There's a lesson here about how power works in human systems. It's not always given to the officially powerful. Sometimes it flows to the people who are most trusted, most present, most willing to do the difficult work of actually managing systems. Eunuchs did the work that needed to be done. They guarded, they managed, they mediated. And in doing that work, they became powerful. By the 1700s, the Ottoman Empire was beginning its long decline. It was not a sudden collapse. It happened over centuries, but it was noticeable. The empire was losing wars. It was losing territory. It was beginning to lose the confidence that had sustained it. And in this period of decline, the power of the harem reached its peak. This seems like a contradiction, but it makes sense when you think about it. As the official systems of power became weakened and unstable, the informal systems of power, the networks of women in the harem, became relatively more important. Some historians have argued that the rise of female power in Ottoman harems in the 1700s was part of why the empire declined. The argument goes, the women in the harem were less interested in imperial power than in family power. They were less interested in expanding the empire than in securing their children's positions. They made decisions for personal rather than imperial reasons. This might or might not be true. It's a hotly debated question among historians. But what's certain is that the women in harems wielded more real power in the 1700s than they had in the 1600s or even 1500s. And then, slowly, the harem began to disappear. Not overnight. It took centuries. But starting in the 1800s, Ottoman sultans began to modernize. They built modern military systems. They began to study European systems of government. They began to reform. And as part of these reforms, they began to move away from the harem system. It started small. Sultans spent more time outside the palace. They met with officials more directly. They were less isolated. The power of the harem diminished. And then, in 1922, the Ottoman Empire fell, it was replaced by the Turkish Republic, and the new Turkish Republic, under Mustafa Kemal, explicitly rejected many Ottoman traditions. The harem was seen as a symbol of the backward, theocratic Ottoman past. The harem system ended. But here's what's interesting. It didn't end entirely. It ended in formal structure, but informally, in harems elsewhere. In the Islamic world, the patterns persisted. In Morocco and Egypt and Iran and Iraq, harems continued to operate into the 20th century. Some still exist today, though with much less power and visibility. And the lessons of the harem, about how women operate when they're denied formal power, about how information and relationships become currency, about how patience and strategy can accumulate power. These lessons remain relevant. The harem is also relevant because it teaches us something about gender and power. It shows that power is not simply distributed by the formal system, that even in a system designed to completely exclude women from power, women found ways to exercise power, for better and for worse. Because we should be clear, the harem was a system of oppression. Women didn't choose to live there. Most were enslaved. All were denied freedom. All were denied the right to leave, to marry whom they chose, to live lives of their choosing. Some were abused. Some were killed. The fact that some women managed to accumulate power within the system doesn't make the system good. It makes the system tragic. It shows how humans can persevere even in terrible circumstances. It shows how people can find agency even when they're denied official agency. But it doesn't make the oppression acceptable. Now, let's talk about something that rarely gets discussed when we talk about harems. What happened to the women when the harem ended? When the Ottoman Empire fell, what happened to all the women living in harems? What happened to the valida sultans? What happened to the concubines? Some of them were freed. Some of them were given pensions. Some were rehomed. Some disappeared from the historical record entirely. And the historical record itself is fragmentary. We know a lot about the most powerful women, the ones whose names appear in documents. But most of the women in harems disappeared from history. We know they existed, but we know almost nothing about what happened to them. This is part of the tragedy of the harem. It wasn't just that women were imprisoned and enslaved. It's that their stories were lost. They shaped empires but left almost no record of their own experiences. We have a few accounts written by women. Some diaries, some letters, a few memoirs written from exile. But for the most part, the harem is known to us through documents written by men about women. This is true of most of history, but it's particularly acute with the harem because the harem was deliberately secretive. It was closed to outsiders. The women inside rarely wrote for public consumption. Their words, their thoughts, their full humanity, much of it is lost to us. What we have are fragments. We have the names of the most powerful women. We have scandals and gossip that made it into official records. We have the testimony of people who visited or lived near harems. But the interior life of the harem, what it was actually, like to be a woman locked away, separated from the world, competing for favor, much of that remains unknown to us. This brings us to the final chapter of our story tonight. We've traveled a long way together tonight. We've moved from the paintings that lied to us, from the European fantasies of harems, to the reality of what harems actually were. We've seen how a system designed to completely exclude women from power somehow produced some of the most powerful women in history. We've seen how isolation, which we might assume would make women powerless, sometimes made them more powerful because it forced them to develop skills and relationships and understanding that couldn't be easily challenged from outside. We've seen how women navigated a system that gave them no official rights and turned it into a ladder they could climb. But I want to leave you with a final thought as we wind down for the evening. The harem is not a celebration of female power. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy because women had to be so clever, so patient, so strategically brilliant just to survive, just to have agency, just to matter. In a system where women had rights, where women could own property, where women could speak publicly, where women could make decisions about their own lives. In such a system, women wouldn't need to be as strategically brilliant. They could just be. The harem is a testament to human resilience in the face of oppression. But it's a tragedy that such resilience was necessary. And as we close this story tonight, I want you to remember that these women were real. They lived. They experienced joy and suffering. They shaped the world. And then, for the most part, they were forgotten. History is often told by the people in power, the soldiers and generals and rulers. But the harem reminds us that there are always people operating outside the official narrative of power. There are always people whose influence is hidden. There are always people whose story needs to be told. Thank you for spending this evening with me. Thank you for stepping into the palace. Thank you for meeting the women who shaped empires from behind walls. Now, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let sleep find you as gently as the night. Good night.